The phone never rang. Not once. Not all day. Evelyn Carter stood at her kitchen window at 6:47 in the evening, watching the last of the Savannah light disappear behind the oak trees, and she understood, with the kind of clarity that only comes after you have stopped lying to yourself, that nobody was coming. Nobody was going to call. The birthday cake sitting on the counter behind her, 79 candles unlit, was not going to be blown out tonight. Not because of the smoke detector, not because she had forgotten, but because blowing out candles alone at 79 in a house this silent did not feel like a celebration. It felt like a goodbye to everything she used to have, everything she used to be, and everything she had spent the last decade pretending she did not miss. She had texted Claire 4 days ago, her only daughter, her own flesh and blood. Just a few careful words. "My birthday is Saturday. Would love to hear your voice." Claire responded with 3 heart emojis and a promise to call around noon. It was almost 7 o'clock now. Evelyn picked up the phone the way you press on a bruise, already knowing it will hurt, doing it anyway because some part of you still needs to know the wound is real. The screen glowed, empty and indifferent. She set it face down on the counter and stood there in the quiet. And the quiet stood right back, heavy, patient, unmoved. She had not always been this woman in the silent kitchen with the unlit candles and the phone she was afraid to check. She had not always been someone the world forgot on her birthday. For 31 years, Evelyn Carter had been the kind of woman a town builds itself around without ever realizing it. Head librarian at Chatham County Public Library, the woman who stayed late every single Tuesday evening to help the seniors who could not figure out the new computer systems, the woman who showed up to every funeral in the county with a casserole still warm from the oven, who remembered the birthday of every colleague, every neighbor, every regular patron who walked through the library doors. She had said yes so automatically, so completely, for so many years that she had long since stopped asking herself whether she actually wanted to. Her calendar was color-coded in 4 different pens just to keep the obligations from collapsing into one another. She had been needed, constantly, urgently, gratefully needed. And being needed had felt, for a very long time, exactly like being loved. She had never understood, back then, that those were 2 entirely different things. Then, Harold got sick. Harold Eugene Carter had served 2 tours in Vietnam before he ever kissed Evelyn for the first time. He had come home from that war quieter than he left, carrying things inside him that had no names, sleeping with one eye open for years before he finally, slowly learned to rest again. He never talked about what he saw over there. Not once in 43 years of marriage did he sit down and tell her the full story of what that war took from him. But sometimes, late at night, when the house was completely dark and completely still, he would reach across the bed and find her hand in the dark and hold it, not saying a word, not needing to, just holding. And she had always understood, without either of them ever speaking it aloud, that this was him saying everything he could not put into language. This was him saying, "You are the reason I came back. You are the reason any of it was worth surviving." He was diagnosed in October, gone by the following March. He died on a Tuesday morning in the same bedroom where they had slept together for 43 years. His hand folded inside hers, his eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, one long, slow breath that released and simply never returned. The doctor came in and said it was peaceful. Evelyn nodded. She thanked him. She walked out to the hospital parking lot in the cold morning air and sat down in the driver's seat of their old Buick and stayed there for a full hour, engine off, hands in her lap, before she could remember how to make herself drive home. That was 11 years ago. 11 years of waking up every single morning to a bed that was too large and too cold on one side. 11 years of making coffee for 2 people out of pure habit, and then standing at the counter with the second cup in her hand, not knowing what to do with it, setting it down and watching it go cold. 11 years of telling people she was fine when they asked, because the real answer, the full, raw, exhausting truth of what it felt like to lose the person who had been the center of gravity for your entire adult life, was not something you could hand to someone in the middle of a grocery store without watching them take a slow step backward. So, she said fine. She said getting along. She said can't complain. And she meant none of it. And one by one, so gradually she barely noticed it happening, the world that had once surrounded her and filled her days and given her the feeling of being woven into something larger than herself, quietly packed itself up and left. Her dearest friend, Ruth Lawson, 40 years of Sunday phone calls, of shared grief and shared laughter, of knowing each other's stories so well that finishing each other's sentences was not a trick, but a reflex, had moved to Phoenix 3 years ago to be near her grandchildren. They had promised each other nothing would change. For a while it hadn't. Then the Sunday calls became every other Sunday, then monthly. Then a Christmas card 2 years ago that Evelyn still kept in the kitchen drawer because throwing it away felt like admitting that something was truly, permanently over. Dorothy died in the spring of 2022. A stroke, sudden and complete, the way Dorothy herself had always been, there one moment and simply gone. Barbara had drifted away into a second marriage and a new life that apparently had no room in it for old friends. And James, patient, gentle James, who had sat across from Evelyn at the library board table for 15 years and always had a quiet word of encouragement when she needed it most, had developed dementia and been moved by his family to a care facility somewhere in North Carolina. His daughter had sent a card. She had written inside it, "He always spoke so fondly of you." Past tense, as though Evelyn, too, were already somewhere unreachable. She had stood at this very window one evening that fall and scrolled through her phone contacts the way you walk through a house after everyone has gone, room by room, opening doors, touching things that no longer belong to the life you are living, understanding slowly and painfully how much of what you believed was permanent was only ever borrowed. One night, a bad night, the kind she never spoke about to anyone, the kind that came without warning and stayed until dawn, she woke at 2 in the morning with a tight, strange pressure in her chest and lay perfectly still in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house around her. And the thought that rose up through the darkness was not about Harold, and it was not about Claire, and it was not about any of the friends she had lost or the life that had contracted around her. The thought was this, plain and terrible and quiet as the room itself. If something happened to her right now, in this bed, in this house, how many hours would pass before anyone in the world noticed she was gone? She did not sleep again that night. She did not sleep well for a long time after that. She started leaving the television on when she went to bed, not to watch it, just for the voices, just to have the sound of human presence in the house, even borrowed and artificial, even the voices of strangers talking about things that had nothing to do with her life. She started talking to Harold's photograph on the mantel every morning while she made her coffee, quietly, briefly, the way you speak to someone you are not entirely sure can hear you, but cannot bear the silence of not trying. She started checking her phone every 10 minutes, every 5, not because she genuinely expected a call, but because the act of checking, the small ritual of looking, of hoping, of not yet giving up, still felt like something, still felt like proof that she was waiting for a life that had not entirely finished arriving. And that was the thing nobody had ever warned her about. It was not the loneliness itself that wore her down. It was the hoping, the relentless, exhausting, quietly undignified hoping that today would be the day something changed. That today someone would call and say, "I was just sitting here thinking about you," and mean it without being reminded, without being nudged, without the careful breadcrumb trail of hints she had become expert at leaving. She had spent 3 years managing her loneliness like a second job, timing her texts for maximum response, mentioning her birthday weeks in advance in casual conversation, framing her need in language soft enough not to burden anyone, but heavy enough that someone, anyone, might feel it and reach back. She was so tired of it, so deeply and completely tired of needing to be chosen by people who had already, in every way that mattered, moved on. The snow came to Savannah 3 weeks after her birthday. Thin and uncertain, the way Savannah snow always is, wandering down from somewhere colder, dusting the magnolia leaves as if it had gotten lost on its way to somewhere else entirely. Evelyn woke before sunrise, made coffee in the old Vermont percolator Harold had bought on a work trip in 1987, and carried her mug to the kitchen table without turning on any other lights. She sat down. She looked out the window at the snow falling in the dark backyard. She was not waiting for anything. She noticed that first, and the noticing surprised her. The absence of waiting. No phone pulled close within reach, no half-written texts sitting in her drafts, no quiet calculations running in the background about whether this might be a good moment to call Claire, whether the timing might make it more likely to be answered. Just her. The coffee warm between her hands, the snow outside the window falling the way it always falls, without permission, without announcement, without any concern at all for whether anyone is watching. A cardinal landed on the feeder at the edge of the yard, startlingly red against all that white, red as an alarm, red as something that refuses to be invisible. It sat on the feeder and ate with complete and total indifference to the cold, to the snow, to the darkness that was just beginning to soften at the edges as morning came. It did not look around. It did not check to see whether it was being noticed or appreciated or remembered. It simply was. Present. Alive. Enough. Evelyn watched it for a long time without moving. She thought about Harold, not with the desperate, clawing grief that she had carried for years, the kind that felt like reaching for something just beyond your fingertips, the kind that left you emptier than before you started. She thought about him gently. She thought about Sunday mornings at this exact table, the two of them sitting across from each other with their sections of the newspaper, not speaking, not needing to speak. The silence between them so warm and so complete that it had felt less like absence and more like its own kind of conversation. She had thought that was ordinary. She had taken it completely for granted. She understood now, sitting alone in this kitchen 11 years later, that it had been the rarest thing she had ever been given, to sit beside another person in total silence and feel, down in the bones, that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. She thought about Claire, carefully, without the anxious, wounded edge that usually came with it. Claire was 46 years old. She was raising 2 children largely on her own, managing a marriage that required constant tending, working a job that regularly swallowed her evenings and most of her weekends. Evelyn had always known this, had known it clearly and completely, but knowing it had never been enough to stop the need, the deep, irrational, impossible to argue with need to be reached for, to be remembered, to be chosen by her own daughter on her own birthday without having to ask. She had confused love with being chosen. She had confused love with being someone's first thought. And every time Claire didn't call, it hadn't felt like simple disappointment. It had felt like a verdict delivered on everything Evelyn feared was true about herself, that without her usefulness, without the role and the purpose and the constant availability, she was someone people thought of occasionally and forgot easily. But sitting here now, in the snow quiet of the kitchen, with the cardinal on the feeder and the coffee going warm in her hands, she could see it differently than she had before. Claire loved her. Claire was exhausted and overwhelmed and barely keeping herself upright most days. Both of those things were completely, equally true. And the cruelest thing Evelyn had been doing to both of them was treating every missed call as evidence of the second truth while refusing to see the first. She got up from the table,
She walked to the hallway closet and reached up to the high shelf and brought down the box she had not opened in 4 years. Harold's box. Inside it, letters in his careful, unhurried handwriting. His navy dress uniform folded in tissue paper that had gone yellow at the edges. His medals from his service, 2 of them in a small velvet case that she had never been able to look at for very long, because looking at them meant thinking about all the years he had carried what those medals represented, silently, without complaint, without ever once asking her to share the weight of it. A photograph of him at 23 years old, standing on the deck of a ship somewhere in the Pacific, squinting into a sun she couldn't see, so heartbreakingly young that looking at it now felt like being handed something fragile. And at the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, a birthday card she had made him in 1974 from construction paper and dried wildflowers she had picked herself because they had not had money for a real card that year, and he had kept it for 40 years in this box, in tissue paper, as if it were made of something that deserved to last.
She sat down on the hallway floor, slowly, carefully, the way 79-year-old knees require, and she opened the box and stayed there for 2 full hours, not weeping dramatically, not performing grief for an audience that wasn't there, just sitting with the full, quiet, unhurried weight of a life that had been real and flawed and sometimes painful and completely, irreversibly hers. The phone rang that afternoon. She almost didn't recognize the number. Then something in her chest did before her mind caught up. Marcus, her grandson, 15 years old, Claire's youngest, the quiet one, the reader, the boy who would rather spend a Saturday with a good book than anywhere else, who had inherited from Evelyn a specific and serious love of anything with pages. He called rarely. When he did, he never wasted the call. "Hey, Gran." 2 words, and something that had been clenched tight inside Evelyn's chest for longer than she could honestly measure simply, quietly, let go. She smiled before she even spoke. "Marcus, well, this is a nice surprise." His voice was honest and slightly uncomfortable in the way only a teenager's voice can be. "Mom told me your birthday was a few weeks ago. I forgot, and then I felt bad about forgetting, and then more time went by and I felt worse about it, so I just kept not calling. But that was stupid. I should have just called." Evelyn was quiet for a moment, holding the phone, sitting in Harold's chair by the window, 79 years old, and a 15-year-old boy had just said the most genuinely honest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she wanted to count. "It's all right," she said, and for the first time in years, not as a performance, not as reassurance, but as simple truth, she meant it completely. They talked for 40 minutes about Harold and what he had been like when he was young, about the Navy and the stories he used to tell on the rare evenings he was willing to tell them, about books Marcus was reading and a mystery series Evelyn described with enough enthusiasm that Marcus promised solemnly to look it up before they hung up. It was the longest conversation she had had in months that felt like 2 actual people talking to each other because they wanted to. Not obligation performing as warmth, not guilt wearing the costume of a phone call, but genuine connection, unhurried and unscripted, between a grandmother and her grandson on an ordinary winter afternoon. When the call ended, she did not move for a long time. She sat in Harold's chair in the fading winter light and thought about all the energy she had spent, years of it, enormous, invisible quantities of it, chasing connection in exactly the wrong direction, looking outward, measuring her worth in response rates and returned calls, and whether people remembered without prompting. Wearing herself down to nothing, trying to remain unforgettable to people who had, quietly, without malice, simply moved on. And here was Marcus, calling with no nudge and no reminder, staying on the line for 40 minutes, not out of obligation, but out of the simple, uncomplicated desire to hear her voice. That was not performance. That was not guilt. That was love in the form love actually takes when it is real, unhurried, unannounced, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon in winter without being asked. She had more of that in her life than she had been capable of seeing. She had just been too consumed by staring at the empty chairs to notice who was still at the table. Spring came to Savannah all at once, the way it always does, sudden and extravagant, wisteria bursting purple over every fence and gate, the air going warm and thick and sweet overnight, as if the season had simply decided and was done waiting. Evelyn began taking morning walks again, short ones, just to the end of Willow Lane and back, stopping to speak to neighbors she had barely acknowledged in years. She went to the library on Thursday afternoons, not to work, just to sit in a chair by the window and read in a place that had always felt more like home to her than almost anywhere else. She stopped loading her texts with Claire, camouflaged as small talk. When she called with something to give rather than something to extract. A funny thing Marcus had said. A book she had loved, a memory she wanted to make sure got passed forward before she forgot it. The calls were shorter. They were also, in ways that were harder to measure but impossible to miss, warmer. She let the faded friendships rest, not in bitterness, not with the tight, burning resentment of someone who feels wronged, with something that felt more like the grace you extend to a beautiful thing that has simply finished its season. Grateful for what it was, no longer grieving what it isn't. She stopped chasing people who had already chosen their distance. She stopped saying yes to invitations and obligations that left her feeling emptier than before she'd accepted them. She stopped performing availability for a world that had moved on and started slowly, carefully attending to the life that was actually in front of her. And in that quieter life, that smaller, simpler, stripped-down life from which she had removed the performance and the people-pleasing and the bottomless need to be chosen by someone, anyone, just to feel that she still existed, she found something she had genuinely not expected to find at 79 years old. Herself. Not the librarian, not the woman who brought casseroles, not the one who color-coded her calendar and said yes before the question was finished and stayed late and showed up and was endlessly, exhaustingly available. The first version, the original, the girl who had loved books so fiercely that she had built an entire working life around being near them. The woman who could sit at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a snowstorm outside the window and feel in her chest something that was not grief and not loneliness, but something older and quieter. Something that might, if she let herself call it what it was, be called peace. The wife who had made a birthday card from construction paper and wildflowers in 1974 because she understood even then, at 27 years old, with no money and a small apartment and a whole life still ahead of her, that love is not measured in what you spend, it is measured in what you mean. The grandmother who laughed a real laugh, a surprised and genuine laugh, when a 15-year-old boy asked if his grandfather was actually cool. She had been there the whole time, waiting. She had just let the world get very loud for a very long time. On a warm April evening, Evelyn sat on the front porch of the blue house on Willow Lane with a glass of iced tea sweating gently in her hand and watched the fireflies begin their slow, scattered rise across the yard, one by one. Small lights appearing and disappearing in the dark, alive for just a moment. Perfectly beautiful without asking anyone to notice, without needing to be seen to justify the light they made. She thought about a birthday cake with 79 unlit candles.
She thought about a phone checked every 5 minutes like a wound that wouldn't close. She thought about lying awake at 2 in the morning asking a question she had been too frightened to finish. And she understood now, sitting here in the warm dark with the fireflies and the iced tea and the quiet street and the life that was still undeniably hers, smaller than it had once been, slower than she had ever imagined wanting, and more genuinely bone-deeply peaceful than anything she had felt in more years than she could count. She smiled, not for anyone watching, not for Claire, not for Marcus, not for the neighbors who passed occasionally on the sidewalk below, not for Harold's photograph on the mantel inside, not for any version of herself that still needed to be seen, just for herself. For the very complete, unhurried first time. Solitude is not punishment. It is where you finally meet yourself. And she was, at last, with no reservation and no performance and no one watching, glad to be home. If this story reached something in you tonight, if you recognized yourself in Evelyn, in her silence, in her waiting, in her exhausted and beautiful and hard-won letting go, then you already understand why this place exists. These are not stories that simply pass the time. These are stories that give it back to you. Subscribe to the 11th Hour's Last Words. Come back whenever the world gets too loud. We will always be right here.